All right, we're here for chapter 11 lecture on the PowerPoint for social psychology. And I apologize in advance. This is a long chapter, so you guys might have your work cut out for you. I know that Mrs. Maupin put some activities up that'll hopefully make it a little bit more digestible and easy to track, but this is one of my favorite realms or topics or disciplines within psychology. It's very interesting and it's easy to, I think, understand and process because it relates to everything you guys are interacting with in the world, society, and social media, friend groups, social skills, all the things that you guys are fully immersed in. So hopefully this can bring up some interesting topics and conversations and just thinking and processing. So what is social psychology and its focus? Social psychology uses scientific methods to study how we think about, influence, and relate to one another. So anytime you have humans interacting, and not just humans, animals have social tendencies, and there's a study of social, animalistic psychology or zoology, and some important definitions you guys will find on page 315. And a lot of this PowerPoint will just be kind of elaborating on some of the terms. We'll have some videos, and then the exercise you guys will do later is going to hopefully go through more of the content. But the important definitions here, I think I said page 315, you have fundamental attribution error. And we've talked about our biases in the past with confirmation bias or hindsight bias. This is sort of similar, and it's the tendency when you're analyzing other people's behavior, you will typically overestimate the influence of personal traits and underestimate the effects of the situation or contextual traits or the environment's influence. So, and you'll probably notice this if you're ever upset with someone, the first instinctive or impulsive assumption is usually that, oh, they decided to do that. Their personality is they're just mean and rude and disrespectful, and that's why they made that decision, or that's why they treated me that way, or that's why they forgot to ask me to come to that party, or that's why they did this. But what's more likely and what's usually dismissed or neglected is the context for why someone makes a decision or why behavior happens. And there's usually more things at play, whether it's environmental influences or family dynamics or cultural things or even social influence. There's a lot of things that we look away from or we don't typically process as well. So that's an important thing that's pretty crucial in social psychology, is that assumption that we oftentimes make. Another is peripheral route persuasion. And this is what occurs when people are influenced by unimportant cues, such as a speaker's attractiveness or a smell you have when you're around something that's appealing, something that's peripheral. So if you think of peripheral vision, it's the things you see on the outside without having to focus. And that's kind of what this persuasion technique or phenomenon is some other cues or other things that you're sensing, maybe less aware of or focused on, but they influence your judgment or your decisions or how you understand something. And this can be really a powerful dynamic if you think about some of the things we process even from the news or from marketing or advertisement. When someone's trying to sell you something, there's neural marketing, and that's the use of peripheral route persuasion and different techniques to influence people's decisions. Like what you want to buy, it could be based on things you're not even registering on a conscious level. So lots of fun and interesting things with that. Central route persuasion is what occurs when interested people focus on the arguments and respond with favorable thoughts. And so if you have someone who already thinks something is kind of like your confirmation bias, they're going to continue to build on that argument and on that idea. And it's going to register as favorable or pleasurable or preferred because it's aligned with their interests. We are going to watch a video real quick. So
have you ever been to the mall or a shopping center and you see those carts with the very aggressive salespeople? As you walk by, they'll scream, "Excuse me, sir," or "Ma'am, Could I ask you a question? Now, you're generally the kind of person who allows other people to ask them a question, so you say, sure. And they'll ask you something like, how do you think you would look in hair extensions? Or, have you ever thought about buying a timeshare? And they got you. This is known as the foot in the door technique, and it works extremely well. Basically, the way it works is somebody will ask you for a small favor or a small request, and then subsequently ask you for a larger favor or a larger request. And if you agree to the first smaller request or favor, you will be more likely to comply with their larger request later on. In 1966, two researchers, Jonathan Friedman and Scott Fraser, decided to test this technique to see if it was real and there was some real science behind it. In experiment 1, the researchers contacted 156 women who were at home during the workday. They divided this group of 156 women into 4 smaller groups, 3 of which they called by telephone and asked a question. The question was, can you tell me what kind of products you are using? What kind of household products, soaps, and so forth? They made note of those who complied and thanked them for their time. Now, 3 days later, the researchers called upon the same 3 groups of women, plus the 4th group with whom they had no contact up until this point. This time, they asked a very different question. They asked a pretty large request. They asked the women if it was okay if they could send somebody to their homes during the day to have them catalog what kind of products they use. Basically, ransack their kitchen cabinets. And here's what the researchers found. Out of the first 3 groups that were asked the smaller request, 52.8% of those women agreed to let a complete stranger in their home to go through their cabinets and catalog the different products they're using. Now, this 4th group of women, with whom the researchers had no contact up until this point, only 22.2% of these women agreed to the larger request, and that was to let somebody in their house to go through their cabinets. There was a significant difference between these 2 groups, showing that asking a small favor at first certainly paves the way for agreement for a much larger favor later on. In experiment number 2, the researchers decided to change it up a little bit. This time they contacted 112 men and women. 7 men were actually home at the time, so they included them in the study as well. Like the first study, they took this group of 112 men and women and divided them into 4 different groups. They went to the homes of the first 3 groups of subjects, knocked on the door, and asked them if they would be so kind as to put a small sign in their window or in the window of their car that either promoted safe driving or keeping California clean. About 2 weeks later, the researchers went back to the first 3 groups, plus the 4th group with whom they had no contact, and they asked a large request. They asked them to put a large, pretty unattractive billboard in their yard promoting either safe driving or keeping California beautiful. Now, the researchers wanted to know if it was the message itself that was influencing the participants to put the larger billboard in their yard. So, for example, if the participants at first agreed to a small sign about traffic safety, would it matter if they were asked to put a large billboard about keeping California beautiful? And they found that no, it did not. There was no difference whatsoever. So it wasn't about the message. It was about complying. The researchers finally concluded that what was going on was a change in the person's feelings about becoming the kind of person who actually complies with these kind of requests. Once the person agreed to a small request, they had a new self-image. They had the self-image of being the kind of person that agrees with these kind of requests. This technique has implications in many areas of life, specifically sales, marketing, and even politics. Now that you are aware of this technique, you can be more vigilant when somebody tries to use this technique on you. The next time you're walking through the mall and somebody says, "Excuse me, sir," or "Ma'am, can I ask you a question?" Just smile, keep walking, look at them, and say, "You just did."
Clever. All right, so each of these phenomenons or theories or biases that we're talking about in each of these definitions has a number of social psychological experiments or research or tests that have supported them or gone into them. So if you're interested in any particular one, feel free to look up studies or ask Mrs. Moppin or myself what are some interesting studies that have led to these phenomenons or theories. This one's interesting and I think very relevant to how we behave, and it kind of has to do with behaviorism, which we just talked about in the last chapter. This would kind of be like priming, where you want something out of someone, so you prime them by giving small gestures to lead up to what you eventually want. So an example of this, apart from what examples were already given, something that I use this for in my work is if I'm working with like an aggressive student or someone who's really upset or someone who's non-compliant or doesn't want to do what their teacher's asking them or doesn't want to do what someone's telling them to do, I'll start with small, insignificant requests that have to do with something they're interested in. And then you build up compliance or you build up that trust until that person's doing the thing that you want them to do. And then again, going back to the behaviorism content we talked about, you're reinforcing and you're praising and you're giving a response to that to make it happen more often. So that is the foot in the door phenomenon. And this definition is on page 317 with these other important definitions. Now, a role is, and you probably can assume, a set of expectations about a social position that you have. It's usually defined based on how those in the position ought to behave. So, for example, you guys are someone's son or daughter, and maybe a brother or sister, a cousin, maybe a niece or nephew. You're also a student. You might be a team player on a sport. You might be a friend. You might be a girlfriend or boyfriend. You might be you have all these roles that you're classified by in society, and we make up all these words to give each other assigned roles and purpose and to better understand what our behavior is going to be like. So, for instance, if your role as a friend and your role as a boyfriend or girlfriend, those simple phrases to make a pretty significant distinction on what behavior we expect. You don't expect just any friend to buy you flowers or to be physically affectionate or to treat you like you're on top of the world, which is what you should expect from a boyfriend or girlfriend or a significant other, whatever, what have you. And so something as simple as that one interchangeable word establishes that social role, and our understanding of it, and language becomes very powerful in this. And we use that to kind of, again, to know what to expect, to know what behavior is likely going to be involved. The cognitive dissonance theory is the theory that we act to reduce the discomfort or dissonance that we feel when two of our thoughts, cognitions, clash. So if you have conflicting thoughts or ideas, you're going to want to reduce the discomfort that's occurring between them. So an example of this is when we become aware that our attitudes and our actions don't match. We may change our attitudes so that we feel more comfortable. And so the basis of cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a really common technique and model for conducting therapy, it's built on the premise of our thoughts influencing our feelings, influencing our actions, and going in this cycle of thoughts, feelings, and actions, or cognitions, emotions, and behavior, where they each have a strong influence on one another. And so to change behavior, you need to change your thoughts, wouldn't change your feelings or your emotions, the way you process things. And cognitive behavioral therapy is a way of restructuring that. Now, cognitive dissonance theory is kind of a natural way that this happens, where if we have conflicting actions and feelings or behavior and emotions, we want to align them because we want harmony or we want autonomy or to feel good in our thoughts and our mind. And so you might change your actions to align with your thoughts, but sometimes what we'll do is we'll change the way we think to align with our actions. And either way can be positive, but either way can also have negative effects. If we're trying to conform to the group, we might contradict what we think to act or behave how our friends do or how that we think they want us to. And then eventually, because there's a conflict in how you feel and think and then how you're behaving, you might change how you think and feel to align with your behavior. So a simple example of this that can be dangerous for peers or for for adolescents your guys' age would be like substance misuse or smoking or alcohol, and you have a potential that you were raised with the hopefully that these things are not something you should experiment with at your age, something that our society has deemed you need to be above a certain age to partake in. But that belief might be threatened by friends who are saying, no, just try this, or no, just go ahead and do this. And it can be easy to conform to that in our behavior. And then eventually your behavior is contradicting your thoughts and your feelings and how you were raised. So it might lead to your thoughts and feelings changing to conform to what your behavior has been. And that can be a negative influence that cognitive dissonance theory can have as far as changing our minds or changing our behavior. So we have another video here, and this is an interesting little experiment based on an old psychological experiment about social influence. And so social influence is how the people around us and their behavior will influence us and our behavior.
To answer that question, we set up a hidden camera experiment to see if this woman would stand up at the sound of this tone, simply because everyone else is. You might be thinking you'd never go along with this. Or would you? After just 3 beats, and without knowing why she's doing it, this woman is now conforming perfectly to the group. But what happens if we take the group away?
Elaine, please.
Okay, now she's alone. The crowd is gone, and nobody is watching her, except our hidden cameras. What do you think she'll do? She's now conforming to the rules of the group without them even being there. Now, watch what happens when we introduce another outsider who doesn't know the rules.
Have a seat, and they'll be out in just a couple minutes. Thanks so much.
Everybody was doing it, so I thought I was supposed to.
Think she'll teach the new guy what to do? We kept the cameras rolling as more unsuspecting patients arrived. And slowly but surely, what began as a random rule for this woman has now become the social norm for everyone in this waiting room. Here to explain what's going on in their brains is Jonah Berger of the University of Pennsylvania.
This sort of internalized form of herd behavior is part of what we call social learning. Starting at a very early age, when we see members of our group perform a task, our brains literally reward us for following in their footsteps.
When I saw everybody stand up, I felt like I needed to join them. Otherwise, I'm like excluded. Once I decided to go with it, then I felt much more comfortable.
Conformity is how we become socialized, but it can also cause us to develop bad habits or repeat past wrongs.
And it's why even this rebel, who wasn't standing for any of this nonsense, eventually joined the ranks. And the only thing more shocking than seeing how easily conformity affects the way you act is that similar forces are subconsciously shaping the way you think right now.
All right, so interesting little experiment. A lot that can be discussed and that goes into that are things that are kind of behind the thinking of social conformity. Some definitions on page 319. Conformity is adjusting our behavior or thinking to coincide with a group standard or what the collective is doing. And this, again, there's a lot of complication or complicated facets behind this, but it's an interesting example of it in this video. The normative social influence is the influence resulting from a person's desire to gain approval or avoid disapproval. And then the informational social influence is the influence resulting from a person's willingness to accept others' opinions about reality. So these are strong influences that shape us. And again, it's a big part of how we learn initially, is that we're watching others and doing as they do to gain acceptance into a group, but also to learn what behaviors are required to function in a certain setting. And so even as something as arbitrary as standing up at a beep becomes a social norm, and then before you know it, you don't want to be left out and you're curious, so you comply, or there's no reason not to, there's no threat or there's no negative outcome if you join. And so we slowly conform and join and become part of that group. Social loafing, these definitions are on page 325, is the tendency for people in a group to exert less effort when pooling their efforts towards attaining a common goal that when individually accountable. So if you're, and I'm sure you've never experienced this, if you're in a group project and there's 10 people, maybe let's say 5 people, and you're all graded the same based on the ultimate outcome or the result. So this implies that people in that group might exert or provide less effort because it's a pooled effort and you all get the same grade in the end. So you'll see this is different. For some people, you'll probably have different personalities in the group and people that function differently. There's usually the person that takes the lead and distributes or instructs, and then you have the person who does the reading and the person who is creative and does the PowerPoint or whatever kind of group project this is. And then you'll see other people maybe giving less effort. So this is more of the overall, that each person is giving a little bit less because in a collective, it's assumed that the combined efforts will have the same outcome. Some causes of why this phenomenon occurs. People acting as part of a group often feel less accountable, so they worry less about what others think of them. Group members may not believe their individual contributions make a difference. They might not see them as significant or important. And loafing is its own reward. When a group member shares equally in the benefits, regardless of how much they contributed, it's easier to slack off, or it doesn't pay off to try harder. So you may see this in group projects, as we talked about. Social relations have to do with how we relate to one another, and these definitions are on page 327. Prejudice is an unfair and usually negative attitude towards a group and its members. Prejudice generally involves stereotyped beliefs, negative feelings, and predispositions to discriminatory action. A lot of big words in there, but essentially prejudice is just you're against someone or a group or an idea. Stereotypes are generalized, sometimes accurate, but often overgeneralized beliefs about a group of people or a type of person. And so there's a lot of negative influence that stereotypes can have. And usually the stereotypes we hear of are the negative ones, like men are more aggressive, or women are not as good at driving, or any tendency someone might have. You can make a generalization, which means you take that small thing and you assume a lot of other things about them. And usually it's unfair and it's promoted by prejudice, the other definition we just discussed. Discrimination is the unjustifiable negative behavior towards a group and its members. So if you're going to discriminate, it implies that there's no reason to hold this prejudice or to build this stereotype. And it's usually a negative view. And so there's actually a lot of political movement right now around the discrimination against LGBTQ populations, and that that group of people should not be allowed to be discriminated against in the workforce and a number of other places. And so when you're thinking about social psychology, it's a very relevant topic. If you're watching the news or if you're just scrolling through your social media, especially in our current climate, there's a lot of really important things that are happening in the world that involve these type of phenomenons or theories related to social psychology. So social relationships, going a little bit further with some definitions. Implicit racial associations, and I'm looking for where this is. So implicit associations would typically involve a tendency that's inherent, or it's underlying, or it's within you and maybe you're less aware of it, as opposed to explicit associations. So some examples are on page 327 of implicit racial associations. And this is not something someone is overtly or openly aware of all the time, and something we have to build awareness of and try to introspect and think inwardly to become more cognizant and aware of. So people who deny harboring racial prejudice, so having prejudice against different people of different ethnic backgrounds or race, may carry negative associations. And an example they give is that 9 in 10 white people who were in this survey took longer to identify pleasant words, such as peace or paradise, as quote unquote good, when the words were paired with black sounding names such as Letitia or Darnell, rather than white sounding names such as Katie and Ian. These tests are useful for studying automatic prejudice or the implicit racial associations. There is some caution from critics about these type of theories against using them to assess or label individuals as prejudiced, because the notion is that these things are, again, implicit. They're underlying. They're not always at the level of social, or they're not always at the level of conscious awareness. I would say that this is not an excuse to overlook or dismiss some of the implicit racial associations. It's just important to acknowledge that we all have them, and that it takes active, again, introspection and having other people discuss and educate in order to learn about them and to become aware of them. The race influence perceptions, again, is below that. Our expectations influence our perceptions. And so they consider a shooting in 1998 as an example of an unarmed man, Amadou Diallo, in the doorway of his Bronx apartment building. The officer thought he had pulled a gun from his pocket. In fact, he had pulled out his wallet. Curious about this tragic killing of an innocent man, several research teams created a similar situation, and they asked viewers to press a button quickly to shoot or not shoot men who suddenly appeared on the screen. Some of the on-screen men held a gun, others held a harmless object, such as a flashlight or bottle. People in this experiment, including both black and white and police officers, more often shot black men holding the harmless object. So again, this video game-like experiment had people pop up on a screen, and they said, you have to press the button as soon as possible to shoot or not shoot this person, which is kind of a bleak experiment, but I think it has an important outcome, that there is a potential of race influence perceptions that are sometimes below that cognitive awareness or conscious awareness level that may influence quick decisions. So when you're in an impulse situation, you're asked to make a quick reactive decision. Oftentimes there might be an underlying implicit bias or implicit racial association to go with that. So important things to be aware of. Again, considering the climate and the times that we're in, things like this are very interesting, and I think important to be aware of and consider in our own biases and in our personalities. So the psychology of attraction, and these definitions are on page, let me just find them real quick. All right, so this content is on page 334 through about 338. And this talks about kind of the social influence of the laws of attraction. And they go through proximity. It talks about proximity would refer to your closeness or your like how like geographically similar you are, or physically close, or even just what you're exposed to if it's similar. So a lot of what this talks about reflects on the tendency we have to seek out people that have similar proximity to us in culture, in social influence, and social exposure. Even babies they did experiments with, they had the tendency at 3 months old, as young as 3 months, to seek out faces that were the same race, ethnicity that they were used to seeing or that they were around more often. So there is a bit of familiarity that we look for. It talks about proximity breeding, liking, partly because of the mere exposure effect. Again, looking for people that have similar social exposures. Modern matchmaking is super interesting, especially in the last 10 years, how much online dating has just exploded. They talk about here 1,500 online dating sites and around 30 million people a year searching for love. Interesting social phenomenon, considering that concepts like proximity or like-mindedness or similar exposure or the exposure effect typically determine what person you're going to pursue in a romantic interest. However, with technology and the evolution that that's led to, that's no longer the case. You can have someone that you've met online who lives in a different country and doesn't even speak the same language, and you can now communicate effectively and develop a relationship with that person. So some interesting content there. Physical attractiveness. There's a lot of research, and the first section on this talks about it's the first thing you see. It's the first thing you register when you see someone and you find them to be appealing sexually or physically attractive, or to have traits that are similar to yours or what you're used to seeing, or again, that you've been conditioned to find or to appreciate and see as attractive. That's oftentimes a huge driving force in a relationship. But we do have a little bit of that attribution error happening here, where we assume that more attractive people have better lives, have more money, are healthier, etc. But research that's looked a little bit deeper into this has found that people's attractiveness is surprisingly unrelated to their self-esteem and happiness, unless we have just compared ourselves with super attractive people. A few of us view ourselves as unattractive. So depending on what you consider as attractive, or how you view people around you, or what type of attractive people you're around, that will also influence how you see yourself, your self-esteem, but also how you register your physical characteristics. And so physical attraction and looks have a lot of influence in the psychology of attraction. And then similarity talks about, oftentimes you'll hear the phrase opposites attract, but on the contrary, it seems that research shows people who have similar interests or are like-minded will often be more attracted to each other. There's a saying in here about people that love, where is it? When the lovers love many things together and not merely each other, that can be a love that lasts. And so typically people seek out others that want to do the same things. They have the same ideals, values, principles, and that kind of connects you on a lot of different levels, because physical attraction might fade. Any other attributes might be less powerful in the long term. There's also the reward theory of attraction, and that has to do with we like those whose behavior is rewarding to us, including those who are both able and willing to help us achieve our goals. So if you're around somebody that makes you feel good and helps you do things and introduces new things to you, odds are they're going to be a good match for you, and you're going to like them more or longer, depending on the scenario. That concludes our slides for chapter 11. Again, we're going to have some activities that are a little bit more engaging, but I hope this was useful. Kind of just a way to review some of the content. It is a long chapter, so I would say focus on some of the things that are interesting to you and just have a general understanding of some of the other content.